The spring of year brings to us a newborn nature that has been sleeping, and shows there is a resurrection of all living nature. I love it, for I see flowers in their beauty, and gardens with all good things that satisfy our appetites, and all things new. Yes, this is a good place to live in this world, and it is what we make it. In this same letter, fortunately for us, Will recorded now forgotten details about their birthplaces and the sequence of homes their father, F. W. Drake, rented or bought after the Civil War. You, George, he says, were born September 23rd, 1871, in the old Kirk place, a log house near the forks of the road. The next year, 1872, in August, we moved to Spratsville. You were about 13 months old. We lived there that winter and next summer till December 1873, when then we moved back on Quaker Ridge. Joey was born there April 15, 1874. You were about 2 years and 4 months old when we moved back. You see, I was about 16, so I have a very clear recollection of facts. Here, incidentally, Will Drake vents his frustrations about their older sister, Anna Yost, who had her facts all wrong. I had the same trouble telling Anna Yost where she was born, he says. She was born where Charlie, Mary, and me were, our grandpap's upper place. Uncle Harrison bought it, and then we moved about a mile above Cheneyville on old Mrs. Mitchell's farm. Only lived there about 8 months, and Father bought the Kirk place where you were born. Anna thought she was born in Cheneyville. I told her that she was not, and we never lived in Cheneyville, but a mile above it. This was in May 1866, so you see, Anna was very young and sick. She had sore eyes and could see anything scarcely. She was not a year old, but seemingly she knows more about Cheneyville than anyone. Annie, to whom he's referring, had married J. Yost, he of the bald pate and fashionable handlebar mustache. J. Yost would die in his 40s, but Annie would live into her 90s. J. furnishes us with another instance of the closeness between the Drakes and their future in-laws. Here's a group photograph taken in front of a courthouse in Morgan County. As we look at the detail in what was apparently a social club gathering of some kind or other, we see young George T. Drake in the straw boater in the center, leaning on a cane, and to the left, seated, we see his father, F. W. Drake, recognizable because of his lean face, spade-like beard, and full head of gray hair. On the other side of the group, and you will see a faint initial marked in pencil where he stands, we can see J. Yost's handlebar and shiny dome. Because of the small geographic area in which they all lived, the Drakes and their eventual in-laws, whether the Yosts or others, were well known to one another. Mary Adelaide, another sister shown here with one of her daughters, had married Wallace Hall, a St. Clairsville, Ohio farmer. He once made the well-educated Drake children stifle their laughter when he announced that he had come to Columbus to talk about a new school with, as he pronounced it, an architect. The youngest of the Drake girls was Alice Josephine, or Joey, who is shown in a Sodality Club photograph. She's standing at the far left at age 18. This was well before she would meet and marry a railroad engineer, Frank Patterson. In later years, the family would remember her as an elderly woman with severely deformed hands, the result of a crippling arthritis, said at the time to have been caused by exposure to excessive moisture during the 1913 flood that devastated much of southern Ohio. Here, though, we have yet another bit of photographic evidence that the Drakes and their future in-laws knew one another rather well. Seated at the far right in this same print, wearing a light-colored jacket and a plumed hat like the other young ladies, is Nellie Goulding. This was well before she would marry Joey's brother, George Drake. Meantime, the young man who would eventually offer her an engagement ring was separating himself from the rest of his family by entering high school in 1886. This was a time, we need to remind ourselves, when by one estimate only 7% of Midwestern children, owing to the rigors of farm life, ever went on to high school, and an even smaller percentage ever finished. But George would graduate in May of 1890 from the Corning High School. We know that as a student he was active in the district's annual school play in 1889, as this surviving photograph shows. Interestingly, a lot of these community youngsters were portraying hayseed characters in the play, characters not unlike their aunts, uncles, and certainly their grandparents who had migrated off the farms into burgeoning cities like Corning. In the detail, we see George T. Drake, then a junior in high school, wearing an opera hat, sporting a long pointed beard, a light-colored vest, and a lanyard for his glasses. We also see, seated to his left, with a pointed, spade-like beard, his best friend, Dudley Hampton Foster. Foster was a senior and would graduate that same year, 1889. Dudley Foster, shown in this portrait, was descended from a Revolutionary War figure, Colonel John Foster, whose parents had relocated from Maryland to Ross County, Ohio. Joseph Foster, the father of Dudley Hampton, took the family to Pike County and then on to Perry County, where he became a Republican Party leader. Dudley, in his 40s in this picture, entered the Ohio State University in 1890 and received a law degree there in June of 1895. Here is a photograph of the class of 1890 from which George T. Drake had graduated and of which he was valedictorian. Shown standing on the upper left are Superintendent George W. DeLong. His hand rests on the shoulder of the valedictorian. Stella Veronica Adamson, the only woman in the 5-member class, sits in the center. To her left, Charles Dayton Henry. Standing above Henry is Llewellyn Evan Thomas. And standing in the middle is the man who would become one of the most powerful influences in statewide politics, Harry Preston Wolfe. In 1891, Harry would join his older brother Robert in Columbus, where they founded the Wolfe Brothers Shoe Company. 14 years later, they had amassed enough capital and influence to buy the Columbus Dispatch. By 1910, they also owned the Ohio State Journal. The Wolfes became one of the power broker families that virtually controlled Ohio politics. Examining his handwritten manuscript, we know that George Drake thanked Superintendent DeLong and that in his address he spoke of instilling character. It was a rather typical valedictory message for the time, and George took the trouble of quoting lines of poetry. He concluded his address, in fact, with several lines from Sir Walter Scott. And he alluded in one place to having crossed one portion of the narrow sea of life, knowing that another was about to begin. There was also the customary farewell to his classmates and the assurances that the years would not diminish their friendship and closeness. Fortunately, a half-century later, George T. Drake, then 71, recreated his valedictory address before the microphone of an amateur recording machine owned by his son Paul. The fragile 8-inch wax disc, now ravaged by time, is still audible. It can be heard in its entirety near the end of this videotape. In this excerpt, he thanks the superintendent for his kindness and consideration and for having instilled in the graduates nobility of character by precept and example.
We are grateful for every kindness and consideration shown to us. You have been a splendid and valuable instructor, but above all, you instilled in us nobility of character by precept and example. You have witnessed us safely across one narrow sea of life, and now you, as well as ourselves, await to see that voyage which we are about to take upon the greater sea of life. To my classmates, farewell. Our association will be cherished to the end of time.
In April of 1890, just a month before his graduation, young George Drake took the civil service examination for a post office position. His father was then postmaster of Corning. George posted the highest score in the state at the time. He began as a substitute clerk on the Corning to Columbus run and ultimately was put on the limited mail run from Pittsburgh to St. Louis. This was his identification photo. We know that, as many did at the time, young George speculated in oil in and around Perry and Morgan counties. Here he's shown on the lower left, standing atop one of the drive wheels on this drilling rig. Whether this well came in, his caption doesn't say. But we know from at least one other photograph of the 1890s that one of the wells he invested in did come in. Unfortunately, this one went dry prematurely. Overall, though, the high sulfur content of Midwestern oil made it less desirable than Texas oil until a few years later John D. Rockefeller had to pay Standard Oil scientists handsomely to develop a desulfurizing process.